The day we buried my grandfather, I thought I was saying goodbye to the hardest chapter of my life. I was wrong, because before the flowers even wilted, someone was already trying to take what he left behind. 900 acres. Generations of sweat, sacrifice, and legacy. And she believed it belonged to her. At his funeral, of all places, she didn't offer sympathy. She asked for the will. That's when I realized this wasn't just about land. It was about a fight she never expected me to win. The morning of my grandfather's funeral was heavy with an unshakable sense of loss. The air felt thick, carrying the weight of decades of family history, hard work, and memories that were tied so intricately to that 900-acre farm he had devoted his entire life to. Every tree, every field, every worn path through the pastures was a piece of him, a part of the legacy he had worked tirelessly to preserve. The farm wasn't just a stretch of land. It was an inheritance of values, of work, ethic, of determination, and of a way of life that seemed almost timeless in a world constantly rushing forward. As I stood there among family members, friends, and a scattering of neighbors who had known him for years, I felt the silent pulse of the place he had nurtured, a pulse that seemed to beat quietly beneath our feet. The funeral was a somber affair, with a typical procession of flowers, eulogies, and murmurs of condolence. Yet in that somber atmosphere, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was off. I had expected sadness, grief, maybe even moments of reflection, but I had not expected the intrusion that was about to arrive, nor the audacity of the person who would challenge the very foundation of everything my grandfather had built. Amid the quiet sobs and whispered memories, a woman I barely recognized emerged from the gathering. She moved with a kind of determined purpose, her posture rigid, her expression one of calculated intent. This was not someone mourning. This was someone on a mission, someone who had arrived with a single goal, and that goal was not condolences, comfort, or empathy. Before she even attempted to offer a polite word, before any semblance of traditional etiquette could take hold in such a solemn setting, she confronted me with a question that cut through the fog of grief like a knife. "So, where's the will?" she asked, her voice sharp, demanding, and devoid of any recognition that the man lying before us was gone. It was such a jarring moment that it froze me, left me momentarily speechless, and for a few seconds, the world around me seemed to shrink to just the two of us. This woman, who I would later come to know as Karen, the president of the small homeowners association bordering a tiny section of my grandfather's property, had decided that the life, labor, and legacy of a man she barely knew was hers too. Claimed she acted as though she had some divine entitlement, as though decades of sweat, sacrifice, and careful stewardship could be bypassed simply because she had a title and a vision. It was an audacity that was almost impossible to comprehend. At that moment, I realized that this confrontation was not a mere question or idle curiosity. It was the opening salvo in a battle that would test my resolve, my patience, and my understanding of justice. She had come not to grieve but to seize, not to mourn but to claim, and in her mind, it was as if the farm had always belonged to her in her community, not to a man who had built it from nothing. What made it even more shocking was the fact that she had been circulating this plan long before my grandfather passed. For months, she had been telling anyone who would listen that the farm would eventually become part of the HOA's holdings. She spoke openly about constructing a golf course, a luxury clubhouse, and high-end condominiums on land that had been in our family for generations. Seemingly unconcerned by the fact that the man she planned to dispossess was still very much alive, the audacity was staggering. She treated our private property, our family's inheritance, as if it were communal land waiting for her approval. In that instant, standing among the mourners, I felt an overwhelming mix of disbelief, anger, and protective instinct. This wasn't just about real estate, it was about disrespect, entitlement, and a complete disregard for the lives and history of those who had come before her. I looked around at the other attendees, hoping someone else would step in. Someone else would recognize the absurdity and audacity of her actions. But most people were too caught up in their own grief to intervene. The funeral had been planned for months, a solemn tribute to a man who had quietly but profoundly influenced the lives around him. And yet here was Karen, entirely indifferent to the grief in the room, singularly focused on her self-serving agenda. I tried to respond calmly, trying to gather my thoughts as she continued to insist, almost as though the more she pressed, the more her sense of entitlement grew. She wasn't asking out of concern or genuine interest. She was demanding, claiming, an authority she had no right to, making it clear that in her mind, the future of our family's farm was negotiable and subject to her whims. It was at that moment, standing there amidst the sorrow of loss, that I felt a cold clarity settle over me. This confrontation was not going to be a simple misunderstanding or a fleeting challenge. It was the beginning of a prolonged struggle, one that would test not only my legal understanding but also my ability to protect what was rightfully ours. Every interaction from that point forward would be colored by the audacity of that first moment, the audacity of a stranger, assuming ownership over a life's work, a heritage, and a legacy. As the funeral proceeded, the image of her standing there, bold and unyielding, remained seared in my mind. The juxtaposition of our loss and her greed was stark, almost surreal, and yet it perfectly encapsulated the challenge I was about to face. I had inherited more than just the land. I had inherited the responsibility of defending it against someone who believed that rules, decency, and respect were secondary to ambition. Even as the minister's voice carried through the church and the eulogies painted a picture of a life well lived, my thoughts were partially consumed by this looming threat. Karen had made it clear. She intended to turn our family farm into her personal project, and she was not going to let anything or anyone stand in her way. The question of the will, asked with such brazen entitlement at a moment that should have been purely solemn, was the opening gambit. It revealed her strategy, her mindset, and her lack of empathy. In that moment, I realized the farm was no longer just a place of memory and heritage. It had become a battlefield. I could feel the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders, heavier than the grief I carried for my grandfather. Protecting this land would mean facing someone who had already demonstrated a willingness to manipulate, intimidate, and exploit any perceived loophole. Her question about the will was not just about legal documentation. It was about control. It was about asserting dominance over a family's history and claiming a future that had never belonged to her. Every step she took, every word she spoke, reinforced the fact that she viewed our private property not as a sacred inheritance but as a resource to be seized. Even amidst mourners, even during a moment that should have been about remembrance, she positioned herself as if she were entitled to dictate the outcome. Standing there, I felt a surge of resolve. I knew I could not allow her ambition to override the law, decency, or the values my grandfather had instilled in me. The confrontation, brief as it was, crystallized the stakes. This was not just a dispute over land. It was a clash between greed and principle, between entitlement and legacy. The farm, every acre of it, represented more than soil and timber. It represented decades of dedication, a family's continuity, and a way of life that Karen assumed she had the right to rewrite. As I processed the audacity of her demand, I realized that the first step in defending our inheritance would require more than emotional strength. It would require vigilance, preparation, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The funeral had ended. The mourners would soon depart, but the shadow of that moment lingered. Karen's question about the will had done more than shock me. It had defined the battleground. She had introduced herself not as a fellow community member or neighbor, but as an adversary. From that moment forward, I knew that the path ahead would be challenging, fraught with legal entanglements, confrontations, and tests of character. And yet, in that same instant, I also recognized the clarity it offered. Her bold intrusion into our family's most sacred moment was a wake-up call. The legacy of the farm was not just about acreage. It was about the principles my grandfather had lived by and the responsibility I now carried. Every field, every fence line, every acre of that land represented not just property, but the essence of a life lived with integrity. The confrontation at the funeral made it clear that I could no longer rely on assumption, on tradition, or on the goodwill of others to protect it. I had to take action. And so, what had begun as a solemn, grief-stricken day transformed into a moment of awakening. It was the beginning of a journey to defend what was rightfully ours, to stand against audacity cloaked in authority, and to ensure that the legacy of my grandfather built over generations would remain intact, untarnished by the ambition of someone who had no rightful claim to it. Karen's intrusion at the funeral was not merely an opening line in a story of conflict. It was the catalyst that set the entire chain of events into motion. It revealed her strategy, exposed her entitlement, and illuminated the reality that the fight for the farm would demand every ounce of resolve, strategy, and courage I could muster. That one question, "Where's the will?" became the symbol of the challenge ahead, the spark that ignited a battle for justice, respect, and the preservation of a family's heritage, all in the shadow of grief. After that shocking confrontation at the funeral, I thought the ordeal might pause for a moment, giving me space to grieve and process my grandfather's passing. I was wrong. Almost immediately, the next wave hit a storm that was as relentless as it was absurd. It started with a letter, not a friendly letter, not a note expressing condolences or understanding, but a formal, intimidating piece of paper that looked like it had been printed by some official government agency. At the top was the name of the Homeowners Association, and below it, a list of supposed violations and fines. The first one accused me of having an unauthorized structure on my property. My barn, which had stood for decades, weathered countless storms, and served as the backbone of our farm operations, suddenly did not exist in the eyes of the HOA. Their letter claimed it violated some obscure rule that could not possibly apply to private farmland established long before the subdivision was ever conceived. I stared at it in disbelief, trying to understand if it was a cruel joke. Surely, no one could be this audacious. But then came the next letter, and the next, each one more ridiculous than the last. My tractor, they claimed, was the wrong shade of green. Apparently, it did not align with community aesthetic guidelines. It was surreal. I had spent a lifetime working the soil, repairing fences, feeding livestock, and tending to crops, and suddenly, the color of my tractor was a punishable offense. I almost laughed, if it weren't so infuriating. And then came the piece de resistance, a fine for excessive wildlife. They argued that having too many deer, rabbits, and other native animals on my property violated some imaginary standard. At that point, I realized two things. First, this was no mistake. And second, Karen and the HOA were trying to bully me. It was a calculated effort to intimidate and confuse me, to make me question my rights, and to pressure me into compliance, or, better yet, a forced sale. I tried to reason with myself, to imagine some logic behind these bizarre accusations, but there was none. My property was clearly defined, legally documented, and entirely private. The HOA had no jurisdiction over the farm, but their letters were crafted to look official. The stamps, the signatures, the formatting, everything was designed to sow doubt and fear. It was psychological warfare, disguised as bureaucracy. For a moment, I wondered if I had somehow misunderstood the law, or if there was some loophole I had overlooked. I reviewed the deed, the county records, and the documentation my grandfather had kept meticulously over the years. Everything confirmed what I already knew. The farm was ours, untouchable by any HOA rules or regulations. Despite the clarity, the letters kept coming. Each one arrived with increasing hostility, demanding payment for fines that were utterly fabricated. I began to notice patterns in the language. Aggressive, commanding, condescending. It was as if they were taunting me, daring me to respond, confident that their official-looking threats would intimidate anyone else. But I refused to react impulsively. I drafted polite responses, carefully explaining that my property was private, that it had never been part of their association, and that their authority ended at my fence line. I referenced historical maps, property deeds, and even county zoning regulations to make the case unassailable. I wanted to be reasonable. I wanted to show that a civil approach might de-escalate the situation, but Karen and her team ignored reason. Every letter I sent was met with escalation, threats of legal action, warnings of foreclosure, and insinuations that I would somehow be held liable if I did not comply with their demands. The sense of surreal absurdity only grew. I remember reading one particularly hostile letter where they claimed I had violated community standards by allowing the natural flow of life on my land. Trees, animals, and even the crops were somehow my crimes. The thought that someone could pervert natural existence into an offense felt both maddening and almost cinematic in its audacity. Yet, underlying the absurdity was a very real threat. Harassment designed to exhaust me financially, mentally, and emotionally. It was clear Karen's strategy was to create pressure points. Make the farm a legal nightmare. Send enough letters, invent enough violations, and maybe, just maybe, I would capitulate and sell the land to relieve the stress. Every morning, I would find another envelope in the mailbox. Each one a new gauntlet, each one demanding my attention and draining my energy. But as frustrating as it was, it also steeled my resolve. I realized that this was more than a battle over property lines. It was a test of perseverance, of patience, and of courage. The fake fines were just the beginning. They were opening moves in a long chess game, and I knew I couldn't play her by reacting emotionally. I needed strategy. I began documenting everything. I photographed each letter, logged the dates, and kept detailed notes of the correspondence. I saved the envelopes, the stamps, the formatting. Every detail mattered. This wasn't just about proving ownership. It was about creating a clear record of harassment that could withstand any legal scrutiny. At the same time, I sought advice from trusted legal counsel. I explained the bizarre nature of the letters, the escalating threats, and the psychological toll they were taking. My lawyer listened patiently, then reassured me. These letters, no matter how official they appeared, were fraudulent. They had no standing in law. The HOA had no authority over my private land, and the fines they were demanding were nothing more than a tool of intimidation. It was a relief to hear, but also a warning. Karen would not stop until she saw a reaction. The harassment was designed to provoke an emotional response, to make me act rashly. Every time a new violation arrived, I reminded myself of that, a mental exercise in patience and focus. Meanwhile, the absurdity of some fines became almost darkly comedic. A letter criticizing the excessive number of deer grazing in the northern field left me shaking my head in disbelief. Could someone really try to criminalize wildlife? Apparently, yes. But behind the ridiculousness was a clear pattern. Karen's goal was intimidation, not reason. She wanted me off balance, questioning my legal knowledge, questioning my rights, questioning whether standing firm was worth the effort. It was harassment in its most sophisticated form, psychological pressure disguised as administrative procedure. I realized then that the real fight had begun long before any bulldozers arrived or fences were torn down. This phase of harassment, through fabricated fines and illegitimate claims, was the first battlefield. Winning here required calm, meticulous record-keeping, and unwavering confidence in the truth. Each letter I received became a challenge, a test of resolve. I would read them, document them, and calmly draft responses. I refused to be intimidated, refused to apologize for owning property that was legally mine, and refused to let grief be exploited by someone else's grief. Over the next weeks, the pattern continued. Karen's letters became increasingly aggressive, occasionally bordering on threats. Some implied legal consequences if I did not comply with HOA mandates. I began noticing the insidious way she tried to manipulate language, blending legal jargon with emotionally coercive phrases. It was designed to make anyone who wasn't confident in property law feel trapped, confused, and powerless. But I was not about to fall into that trap. I had spent a lifetime learning to recognize when authority is being misused, and Karen's claims were nothing more than a veneer of power over a situation she had no right to control. Each letter reinforced my determination. I knew that the next steps, should they escalate beyond paper threats, would require formal legal intervention. But for now, I treated each missive as a tactical move, a test of my patience and strategy. I organized the correspondence meticulously, creating a timeline of harassment that would be invaluable should the dispute move into the courtroom. I also began to realize that this wasn't just a legal fight. It was about character, about proving that integrity, preparation, and perseverance can withstand even the most brazen attempts at intimidation. Each letter, while absurd, strengthened my resolve. I wasn't just protecting property, I was defending a legacy, a way of life, and the principle that greed and entitlement cannot override law and decency. The fake fines, the absurd violations, and the relentless letters were Karen's first salvo. But they also inadvertently revealed her desperation and overconfidence. Every fabricated claim was a piece of evidence, a testament to her willingness to bend rules, twist facts, and manipulate perception. It became increasingly clear that she was not operating in good faith. She was on a personal crusade, driven by ego and ambition, with no regard for legality or morality. By maintaining a calm, methodical approach, I was able to prepare myself for the inevitable escalation. The harassment, while exhausting, had taught me valuable lessons. Never underestimate the audacity of greed. Always document everything, and never allow emotional manipulation to dictate your actions. The letters were absurd, ridiculous, and frustrating, but they were also predictable. They followed a pattern, and patterns can be countered. With the advice of my lawyer, I began drafting formal responses, referencing property deeds, county records, and historical documentation to establish the indisputable truth. My grandfather's land was private, legally defined, and immune to HOA interference. Just when I thought the harassment through letters had reached its peak, Karen decided to escalate. The papers, the fines, the constant mental pressure, they were just the beginning. One quiet Saturday morning, I was jolted awake by a sound that didn't belong on my peaceful farm, the deep, rumbling growl of a bulldozer. My heart skipped a beat. I ran to the window and froze. There, across the northern fence line, a construction crew was tearing through a section of my property, and directing them, pointing and gesturing like a general leading an army, was Karen herself. She looked at ease, confident, almost gleeful, as if she were performing some righteous duty. I could hardly comprehend what I was seeing. After months of mental attacks and absurd fines, this was no longer a paper battle. This was real. This was destruction of private property. I ran outside, yelling for them to stop, but Karen just smirked at me. "We're making way for the new golf course entrance," she said, as if the farm I had grown up on, the land that had belonged to my family for generations, somehow belonged to her. "You're trespassing on HOA property." Her words were audacious, reckless, and completely false. My chest tightened with anger. Every instinct in me screamed to confront her, to physically stop the machinery. But I knew the moment called for strategy, not impulse. I pulled out my phone and dialed the sheriff immediately. As I waited for the deputies to arrive, I tried to document everything. I filmed the bulldozer, the crew, and Karen's aggressive gesturing, making sure that nothing was left unrecorded. The absurdity of the situation was staggering. She had ignored certified legal notices. She had ignored polite responses. And now she had taken matters into her own hands, trespassing with a bulldozer under the assumption that she could rewrite reality. By the time the sheriff's deputies arrived, Karen was putting on a performance worthy of attention. She waved her stack of papers, HOA bylaws, violation notices, and more, claiming they gave her absolute authority to be on my property. She spoke with confidence, even arrogance, insisting that I had no right to interfere. She painted herself as a victim, portraying me as the intruder. I held my ground calmly, but I could feel the tension crackling in the air. I handed the deputy my grandfather's deed, the will, and a copy of the cease and desist letter my lawyer had sent. The contrast was immediate. The deputies scanned the documents, then looked around at the torn fence, at the massive bulldozer in the middle of private property, and finally, at Karen. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm, "based on these records, you are trespassing. You are overseeing the destruction of private property." The smirk vanished from her face. For the first time, I saw genuine fear and disbelief. The bulldozer operator, sensing the seriousness of the situation, immediately shut down the engine. Karen's overconfidence had crumbled under the weight of documented truth. What had started as audacious entitlement now faced a cold, undeniable fact of the law. I pressed charges for trespassing and property destruction, knowing that this moment would be pivotal. The scene at the farm was chaotic, but also defining. Karen had thought that she could bulldoze her way to victory, both literally and figuratively. She assumed that fear, intimidation, and aggressive action would force me to surrender the farm she had never legally claimed. But she had miscalculated. The arrival of law enforcement shifted the balance instantly. The deputies were impartial, methodical, and patient. They carefully observed the destruction, listened to Karen's claims, and reviewed the documents. Provided, in that moment, the absurdity of her plan collided with the clarity of the law. Every false claim, every fabricated fine, every attempt at intimidation came crashing down under scrutiny. Karen had relied on boldness, on the belief that sheer audacity could override legality. But the law does not bend to hubris. She had chosen to ignore warnings, to disregard the cease and desist, and to take direct action against private property. That decision would define the next chapter of her downfall. As the deputies spoke, they explained her violations, not just trespassing, but the deliberate destruction of private property. It was a criminal act, they told her, and one for which she could be held fully accountable. In that instant, the power dynamics shifted entirely. The person who had been issuing threats, who had been attempting to dominate and intimidate, now faced consequences she could not manipulate away. I could see it in her eyes: fear, realization, and the dawning understanding that her arrogance had led her into a corner with no escape. The construction crew, who had been following orders, now found themselves facing potential liability as well. They had been hired under false pretenses, believing their work was authorized. The deputies made it clear that any further action without proper legal authority would be treated seriously. The tension on the farm that morning was palpable. It was a strange combination of surreal comedy and stark reality. Karen, who had thought she could seize control of our family's legacy, was now caught entirely off guard. Her plan, bold and audacious as it had seemed, had no legal foundation. Every aggressive step she had taken had been documented, observed, and now scrutinized. I realized in that moment how important preparation and documentation had been. Every letter I had saved, every photograph of the property, every legal notice had become critical evidence. Without meticulous record-keeping and legal counsel, Karen's audacity might have gone unchecked, leaving me in a far more precarious situation. But armed with facts, evidence, and the law on my side, I had turned her aggression into proof of her misconduct. The bulldozer was silenced, the fence temporarily secure, and Karen herself shaken. Yet the morning was only the beginning. The trespassing and property destruction had escalated the conflict from administrative harassment to a full-blown legal battle. Her willingness to ignore warnings, to manipulate perceived authority, and to act with impunity would ensure that the consequences would be severe. Watching the deputies speak with her, observing her realization that the situation had shifted irreversibly, was both surreal and empowering. I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The farm, which had been under threat not just from letters but from direct physical action, was defended in a way that words alone could not achieve. It became clear that this incident would be a turning point. Karen's attempt to seize land through intimidation and trespass had backfired spectacularly. The law, prepared evidence, and measured response had all combined to neutralize her attack. That morning, the destruction of my property transformed into a demonstration of accountability. Karen's audacity had been met with calm authority, legal clarity, and undeniable truth. The stakes had never been higher, and the farm had never been more at risk. Yet the events of that day set in motion the unraveling of her entire scheme. It was a lesson in vigilance, in preparation, and in the power of standing firm against unlawful aggression. What had begun as letters and fines had escalated to machinery, tearing through a fence, and a confrontation that could have turned chaotic. Instead, it became a clear demonstration. Trespassing, no matter the confidence behind it, would not succeed against documented law and unyielding resolve. That day, I understood fully that property is more than land. It is a legacy, a symbol of a lifetime's work, and a responsibility to defend. Karen had underestimated that. She had assumed that action, without preparation, intimidation without evidence, could achieve her goals. She was wrong. Her illegal trespassing not only failed, but it also laid bare every flaw in her plan and revealed the lengths she would go to, which would later contribute to her total legal and financial downfall. The morning ended with the bulldozer off. The crew halted, and Karen standing in stunned silence. Realizing that the fight she had initiated was one she could not win, it was the first time the scales had truly tipped in my favor, not through aggression, but through preparation, documentation, and adherence to principle. The farm was mine, the law was clear, and the battle was now entering the decisive stage, one in which audacity alone could not carry her forward. Karen had made a critical mistake. She had transformed a paper war into a physical confrontation, one that exposed her overreach, her illegal actions, and her disregard for property rights. That day, I felt a mixture of relief, vindication, and determination. The trespassing and destruction were not just attacks, they were evidence. They were proof of her disregard for the law, her willingness to intimidate, and her total misjudgment of the situation. More importantly, they became the foundation of the legal case that would ensure justice was served. What had begun as a peaceful morning on the farm had become a decisive moment, a turning point in the defense of a legacy built over generations. Karen's actions that day would not be forgotten, nor would they go unchallenged. The bulldozer, the torn fence, and the audacious claims all converged into a single, undeniable truth. Property cannot be taken by force or intimidation, no matter how confident the aggressor. That morning cemented a reality that would guide every step in the coming legal battle. Preparation, evidence, and principle always outweigh brazen audacity. From that day forward, the farm was not just my inheritance. It was my responsibility to defend, and Karen had unwittingly provided the evidence that would secure it. The moment the bulldozer stopped and Karen's smirk faded, it became clear that the battle had entered its most decisive phase. What she had believed would be a quick, audacious grab of our family farm had now turned into a full-blown legal confrontation, one in which every move she had made could be scrutinized, challenged, and held accountable. The sense of gravity that settled over the farm was profound. The land, the fields, the barns, every inch of it represented decades of hard work, tradition, and legacy. And now, the defense of that legacy would be fought not with brute force, but with law, evidence, and principle. One immediately began, coordinating with my lawyer, who had already been preparing for this possibility ever since the harassment letters began. Every absurd fine, every fabricated violation, every letter that had arrived in the mailbox now became critical evidence. The photos of the damaged fence, the videos of the bulldozer, the eyewitness statements from neighbors who had witnessed Karen's trespass, all of it would form the backbone of the case. My lawyer assured me that the law was firmly on our side. He explained that Karen and the HOA had not only overstepped their authority, but had engaged in deliberate harassment, illegal trespassing, and destruction of private property. The weight of their actions would be hard to overcome in court, especially given the meticulous documentation we had amassed. I remember thinking back to that funeral, to the moment Karen had first demanded to see the will, and realizing how far things had escalated. What had seemed like audacious greed in that first encounter had now manifested into tangible destruction and financial liability for her and the HOA. I felt a mixture of vindication and anticipation, knowing that justice, if pursued correctly, would ultimately prevail. The case moved quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. Recorded videos of the bulldozer tearing through the fence, photographs of the damaged property, the original HOA letters with fabricated fines, county records confirming the land's legal boundaries, and sworn statements from community members who testified to Karen's history of overreach and power plays. Even the other residents in her subdivision, some of whom had initially supported her, came forward to confirm that she had repeatedly lied about her plans to seize the farm illegally. The court proceedings were intense, but the narrative was clear. The judge could see the pattern. an individual abusing her position and authority to intimidate, harass, and unlawfully claim property that was not hers. The legal argument was airtight, and each piece of evidence reinforced the central truth that my family's land was being attacked by someone driven purely by ego and greed. As the case unfolded, the outcome became inevitable. The judgment was decisive. The HOA was held fully accountable for the harassment and property destruction, ordered to cover the cost of repairing the fence, pay all of my legal fees, and provide substantial damages for the emotional distress and disruption caused. It was not just a victory for me. It was a reaffirmation of the principle that law and justice can overcome audacity and entitlement. Karen herself faced additional consequences. Removed from her position as HOA president, she also became personally liable for the actions she had taken. Lawsuits from both myself and the construction company she had misled compounded her legal and financial troubles. The fallout was immense. The HOA had to levy a massive special assessment on homeowners to cover the costs, creating tension and anger among the residents who had trusted her leadership. The very community she sought to expand by seizing our farm turned against her, recognizing that her actions had endangered the stability and finances of their neighborhood. Karen, who had once stood arrogantly directing a bulldozer through private property, was forced to sell her own home to cover the judgments and fines imposed upon her. The audacity that had emboldened her at the funeral, that had carried her through months of harassment, had elapsed entirely under the weight of law and accountability. In the aftermath, I received a formal apology from the new HOA president, delivered with a symbolic fruit basket. The gesture was modest but meaningful, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a desire to restore civility. For me, it represented closure, not just of the legal battle but of the emotional and psychological turmoil that had accompanied it. Standing on the repaired fence line, looking across the 900 acres that had once been threatened, I felt a deep sense of peace and accomplishment. The farm, my grandfather's legacy, had been defended. The lessons of diligence, integrity, and courage that he had instilled in me had been tested in the most intense way possible, and they had prevailed. This victory was about more than property. It was about the principle that legacy, when defended with patience, preparation, and moral clarity, cannot be stolen by greed or audacity. Every court document, every recorded letter, every photograph of the damage stood as a testament to the importance of standing firm, of documenting, and of trusting in the law to protect what is rightfully yours. It also served as a stark reminder of human nature that audacity and entitlement often push people to act beyond reason, but that reckoning, when guided by truth and evidence, is inevitable. The farm remained mine, quiet, peaceful, undisturbed, but the experience left an indelible mark. I had seen firsthand how quickly greed could escalate, how far someone might go to seize what is not theirs, and how critical vigilance and preparedness are in defending both property and principle. The legal victory not only restored the physical boundaries of the farm but also reaffirmed the moral boundaries that had been violated. Karen's fall was a testament to the fact that manipulation, intimidation, and unlawful action are not sustainable strategies, no matter how confident one may feel in the moment. In the end, the farm was more than just land. It was a symbol of perseverance, a monument to decades of hard work, and a reminder that standing up for what is right, even in the face of audacity and intimidation, can protect both legacy and justice. Every morning, as I walk the fields, inspect the barns, and watch the wildlife that has always called this land home, I am reminded that some things are worth fighting for, and that truth, preparation, and courage are the most powerful defenses against those who seek to take what is not theirs. The legal victory was not just about restoring what had been threatened. It was about setting a precedent for myself and for anyone who might face similar audacity in the future. It proved that integrity, evidence, and persistence can overcome intimidation and greed. Karen's ambition had met the immovable wall of law and principle, and it had shattered. Standing there, I finally felt the weight lift, not just from the legal burden, but from the tension, anxiety, and fear that had shadowed me since that funeral. The farm was mine, undisturbed, and the lesson was clear. Legacy must be defended, audacity must be checked, and justice, when pursued diligently, will prevail. This final chapter of the struggle cemented the truth that while greed may try to trespass, it is evidence, preparation, and moral courage that ultimately hold the line, ensuring that what is rightfully yours remains intact, no matter how audacious those who try to take it may be.